Welcome to part 40 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll create the game over scene to handle what happens when the player runs out of health. We'll add text game objects, set up input handling, and implement logic to reset the player's health after they die. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and build our game over system. Now that we've wrapped up our UI component for our HUD and our player health, we're going to start working on updating our game over state. Currently in our game, when a player dies, we play our death animation for our player, and then we fade our camera out to black and we restart our existing scene. Instead of just restarting our existing scene, we're going to add a new phaser scene that we'll transition to, and here we'll display a message that says the game is over, and we'll give the player the option to continue their game, which will then transition back to our game scene, or they could quit. Then later on, this could be connected to like a main menu or a title screen. So to start working on this component, first we need to create our new phaser scene. So let's go into our scenes folder, let's make a new file. We're going to call this game over scene. For this, I'm going to go into our UI scene. I'm going to copy our code from here. I'm going to paste that into our game over scene. Let's get rid of our method for updating our health. And then let's get rid of all of our code inside our create method. Let's remove our properties from our class. Now we'll update our class name. So we'll do our game over scene. Now we need to add this to our scene keys. So we go into our scene keys, let's do game over scene. We'll jump back to our new class, we'll update our scene key reference. And now we need to add this to our phaser game configuration. So if we go into our main.ts file, let's add our new scene. So I'm going to copy this line of code here, we'll paste it. Let's reference our game over scene. Now we'll update our scene key to be game over scene. Now that we've added our scene to our configuration, we can update our game scene to transition to our new scene. Let's remove our code here where we restart our existing scene, and we'll do this, we'll do our scene manager, and we'll do start, and now we want to do our scene keys, and we want to do our game over scene. And so now if we want to verify our logic's working, let's jump over to our config file, let's update our player starting health, we'll update it to be 1. So now if we go to our next room, let's have our player collide with one of our wisp. Now our player should die, we should do our animation, and now we should transition to our next scene. Alright, so now we've verified our scene transitions working properly, we're going to update our preload scene to transition to our game over scene while we're working on it, so then that will be easier to test our changes. So if we go into our create method, let's update our start method here, and we're going to point to our game over scene. So now when our scene refreshes, we should just see our black screen. So now for our game over scene, we're going to display a menu to the player that's going to allow them to choose to either continue their existing game, or they could quit. When they choose continue, we'll use this as our trigger to go back to our game scene so our player can continue playing the game, and if they do quit, this would be the trigger to allow us to save our game data and quit back to our main menu. For our game, since we're not saving our game data, we're going to do a hard reload of our browser, which will simulate that we're erasing our existing data for our current session. And so now to create this menu, we're just going to use some basic text game objects, and we're going to add in an icon that'll be our cursor. And we'll need to listen for our keyboard input, so then that way we can navigate our cursor up and down in our menu. So to get started with our changes, first we'll add a text game object that just says game over to our scene. So for this, let's do this, we'll do add, we'll do text, and now for our text we want to center it, so we'll do this, we're going to reference our scale manager. Let's do our width, we'll divide it by 2, and now we'll do 100 for our Y value, and now for our text, we just want to say game over, and now we want to do our text configuration. So now for our text, we'll want to align our text in the center. For our font family, we'll want to do our asset keys. Our font, our press start 2p, so our custom font we're using for our game. Now for our font size, we're going to do 8 pixels. We're going to enable word wrap. And so for our word wrap, we're going to set this to be our width. We'll do 170 for our pixels. And now for our color, we're going to do white. So we'll do color. Now for our string, we'll do FFF, FFF. Finally, for our text, we'll want to update our origin, so it'll be in the center, and that way our text will be centered in our screen. So now for the menu we'll want to add, we're going to need to add 3 game objects. One will be our icon for our cursor, and then the other 2 will be our text game objects, so our text for continue and quit. In order to keep our objects aligned, we'll place these inside a container. So at the top of our class, let's add a new property to keep track of that. And so we're going to do menu container. This will be our phaser, our game objects. Then our container. While we're here, let's add in a few additional properties. And so we're going to need to keep track of our cursor game object, so that way we can update our position as we provide our keyboard input. So let's do our cursor game object. For this, we're going to use an image game object. So we'll do our phaser, our game objects, image. Next, we'll need to handle our input. So for our input, we'll be using our keyboard component. So let's add in controls. So now for our type, we'll do our keyboard component. Then finally for our menu, we'll need to keep track of which menu option selected. And so we'll add a new property and we'll call this selected menu option index. And this will be a number. All right, so now we have our new properties. Let's create our new container and we'll add in our game objects for our menu. So after we create our title text, let's reference our menu container. We're going to set that equal to this. We'll do add. We'll do a container. So now for our position, we'll do 32 for X. We'll do 142 for a Y. And so now let's add in our array of our game objects. So now for our container, we'll want to add in our two text game objects. So we'll do this.add.text. Now for our text, let's do 32 for our X position. We'll do 16 for our Y. And we'll do continue for our text. And now for our text style, for now, let's just do an empty object. And now let's call set origin. We're going to make sure we place this in our top left-hand corner. Let's copy that line of code. And now we'll do our quit text. So we'll do the same X position. For our Y, we'll do 32. Now for our text string, we're going to do quit. And so now when we save, we should see our new container has been added with our text. So now for our text, we'll want to use the same styling that we're doing for our game over text. So let's copy our font styling object here. We're going to move this to a new variable so we can reuse it. So let's do const. We'll do menu text style. For our type, we're going to do our phaser, our types. We'll do our game objects, our text. And now we want to do our text style. So now we'll set that equal to our object. So now we can copy that variable. Let's update our game over text game object to use that. And we'll do the same thing down here for our continue and our quit text. So now we have our two text game objects. We're going to add in a border around our menu, and so that way it'll stand out. So inside our menu container, let's do this. We'll do add. Let's do an image. Now for our position, we'll do 0, 0. Now for our asset, we want to do our asset keys. And let's do our UI dialog asset. We'll do 0 for our default frame. Let's do set origin and place this in the top left-hand corner. Now if we save, we have this nice border around our text. Now let's create our game object for our cursor. So outside our menu container, we're going to do this. We're going to reference our cursor game object. We're going to set this equal to this.add. We'll do an image game object. For our position, let's do 20. We'll do 14 for our Y. Now do our asset keys. We want to do our UI cursor. We'll do frame 0. Now let's update our origin. We'll set it to be 0, so it's the top left corner. And now we'll want to add this to our container. So we'll do this. We'll do our menu container. Let's do add. Let's do our cursor game object. Now that we have our new cursor, now we need to listen for our input so we can update its position. For this, we'll need to create a new keyboard component. So let's do this. We'll do our controls. We're going to set equal to a new keyboard component instance. And now we need to grab a reference to our keyboard plugin. So we're going to do this, our input, and let's do our keyboard. And now we'll add our safeguard to our create method to make sure this actually exists. And so we'll do if not this, our input, our keyboard, then we want to return early. Finally, we need to add our initial value for our selected menu option index. So for this, we'll do our selected menu option index and we'll set it to be 0. Now that we have our keyboard component, we need to add in our code to check to see if one of our keys is being pressed, and if it is, we'll update the position for our game object. For this, we'll add in our update method. So we'll do public, let's do update. For our method, we won't do any arguments, we won't return anything. So now in our update method, we're going to want to listen for our keyboard input for our up and down keys. When our up or down key is pressed, we're going to want to update our selected menu option index. This index is going to keep track of which text game object we're currently selecting. By default, our index is 0, so our continue option here, and so if we press our down key, we'd want to update our index to be 1, and then that way our quit option would be selected. If we press the up key after quit is selected, we'd update it to be 0, and we come back to continue. Finally, we'll add a safeguard to make sure we stay within the bounds of our available menu options. And so, if we already have our continue option selected, if we press our up key, we'll keep our index set to 0. So now to add in that logic, let's do if. We'll reference our controls, and now we're going to check to see if our up key was pressed. So is up just down? When our up key is pressed, we'll do our selected menu option index. Let's decrement it by 1. Now we'll add in that safeguard. So if our selected menu option index is less than 0, we're going to reset it back to 0. Now we'll want to add in a similar check for if our down key was pressed. Let's copy this block of code. We'll do else. We'll do else if this control is down, just down. Now we want to increment our index. And now if it's greater than 1, we want to reset it back to 1. Then finally, if neither our up or our down key was pressed, we just want to return early. So after we've updated our index, we can now use our index to update our Y position for our cursor game object. So let's do this. We'll do our cursor game object. We're going to do set Y. And now we're going to set it equal to 14 plus this, our selected menu option index, and we're going to multiply it by 16. All right, so now if we save, we should be able to test our changes. So now if we press our up key while continue selected, nothing happens. If we press our down key, we move down to quit. If we press down, nothing happens. And now we can navigate back and forth between our options. Finally, for our game over menu, now we just need to add in logic to handle when our player chooses one of our options. So for this, at the top of our update method, we're just going to check to see if our player presses our action, our attack, or our enter key. If they press any of those, then we know they chose one of our options. So we'll do if, let's reference our controls, we'll do is action key just down, or this, our controls, is attack key just down, or this controls, is enter key just down. Then we know we selected one of our options, and so we can return early from our method. And then inside here, we'll just want to check which menu option was selected, and then based on that, we'll go back to our game scene, or we'll refresh our browser. So let's do if our selected menu option index was 1. And so if our selected menu option is 1, that means they chose our quit option. And so this would be our point where we want to save our game and then take our player back to our main menu. For our game, since we don't have our title screen, we're just going to reload our browser, which would have the player restart our game. And so we're going to do window, we'll do our location. Let's do reload. And then we can return early. And if they didn't choose option 1, then they chose option 0. And that means they want to continue the game. And so now we want to go back to our game scene. So for this, we'll do our scene. Let's do start. And now we just want to choose our game scene. And so let's do our scene keys, and we'll do our game scene. All right, so now we want to test our changes. Let's choose our quit option. If we press our attack key, our action key, or enter key, our browser should refresh. All right, now if we choose our continue option, we'll see we start our game scene. However, we have an error because we're not passing in our data to our init method. And so if we want to test our continue logic, let's go into our preload scene. Let's update our scene to go back to our game scene. So now back in our browser, let's have our player go over to our next room. Let's collide with one of our wisp. We'll have our player die. Now we'll come to our game over scene. Let's choose continue. We'll restart our game scene. Nice. All right, so after our player dies and we choose to continue our game, we'll see once we get back to our game scene, we're no longer displaying our player's health. What's happening is when our player died, our health was at 0. And after we got to our game over scene and we restarted, we never reset our player's health back to its minimum value. To fix this, let's go into our game over scene. At the bottom of our create method, let's reference our data manager. We'll do our instance. And now let's do our reset player health to min method. Let's save. Now let's test our logic for continue our game. So now if we have our player go up to one of our wisp, we should die. Our health is at 0. So now we transition to our game over scene. And now if we choose our continue option, we'll see once our game scene starts, our health is now reset back to our minimum value and is set to 1 since that's what we have for our config. All right, so now that we're done testing our changes, let's come back into our configuration. Let's update our player starting max health back to 6. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.